Star Wars is one of the biggest franchises of all time and one of the most lucrative franchises of all time. And it's also one of my favorite franchises, film franchises of all time. However, it's not necessarily all love for the franchise and for the series. Talking about these Star Wars prequels, they are generally hated and generally just despised by fans, by critics, and by just the general public overall. I mean, there's YouTube channels that have built their entire brand on just simply hating the prequels and their reviews kind of tearing them apart. And I'm here kind of today to defend the prequels because I feel like they kind of really get a bad reputation, and I don't think that they necessarily deserve that bad reputation. I don't necessarily think that they are perfect. I don't necessarily think that they are absolutely, mind-blowing cinema masterpieces. However, I definitely don't feel like they deserve the criticism that they get. And I would even go as far as to say that they are good movies overall. I think that there is room there for a lot of debate and a lot of time to kind of reflect and look at them. I mean, it's been now 13 years essentially since we've gotten the last Star Wars movie as far as the prequels go. That was Revenge of the Sith back in 2005. So I think there's been enough time and enough of a gap there to kind of reflect back on those movies and really kind of take a different approach and take a look at them. So this is in defense of the Star Wars prequels, starting with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. So first of all, I want to start with things that the movie doesn't necessarily do well, or some criticism. And a lot of these are my personal feelings towards the movie, but these are also, I feel, legit criticism. I feel like these are things that hold the movie back from achieving the same kind of greatness level that the original trilogy did, and that really kind of hold the movie back in general. I feel like some of these things are definitely not good for the movie. I feel like that they need to be talked about and addressed because, in order to kind of talk about what the movie does well and what where this discrepancy is between how I feel about these movies and how people feel, I think it's important to address some of the criticism against the movie and to kind of acknowledge that and to kind of approach it and talk about what it does well versus what it doesn't do right. So I kind of want to get that off the bat, get that out of the way. What does Phantom Menace do wrong or not necessarily as well as it could have? And there's one there that, obviously I know you're looking for. We'll get to it. Believe me, I'm going to kind of save that one for last. You know what I'm talking about. But to start things off, one of the first things I kind of want to talk about is the acting in this movie. And specifically, the biggest criticism kind of is levied at Jake Lloyd as an actor. And while I agree that there is some kind of not great acting going on in this movie, I don't think it's necessarily Jake Lloyd. I don't think it's his fault necessarily. I mean, you're talking about a fairly new actor at that point. He really hadn't been in much before, and the script itself wasn't exactly written in a way that was conducive for a young actor or somebody who really hadn't been familiar with movies before that. But as far as the acting goes, my criticism toward it would actually be more levied at Natalie Portman. She, at that point, was an established actor. She had been in movies before. She was still a very young actress at that time, so there's a little bit of room there. Again, the script itself, which is another complaint that I have, it isn't exactly great for those conversations. We know those awkward moments. It especially shows during the interactions between Padme and Anakin, and you really kind of feel this awkwardness during those scenes. But I kind of feel like her acting in general just comes off as really stiff. Really kind of forced to get those lines out. She seems really disinterested throughout most of the movie, and I think that's kind of where the bad acting criticism really kind of comes from. I think there's not enough really focused on that, and not to be too harsh on it, but again, I think a lot of it kind of had to do with the direction, and a lot of it had to do with the script itself just generally being a weird way to phrase certain things. But other than some scenes here and there, it just really, really feels like she's just kind of phoning it in throughout the entire movie. And it's not necessarily a horrific performance. It's not necessarily a really bad performance, but it's just not that good. And it's one of the things to me that really kind of holds the movie back. And that brings me to the next thing, because again, that's really not that important, but still kind of a legit criticism, is the script itself. And I think that the conversations in the script are just written in a weird way that kind of wants to be formal but also casual at the same time, and it just comes off often as cringy, forced. It doesn't give the actors a lot of room to work with. I think that Ewan McGregor and Liam Neeson kind of do a good job with some really kind of awkward lines. I think that the other actors in here kind of make things work. Ian McDermott does a good job with his Palpatine scenes, but just generally speaking, most of the lines are just feel like they're kind of written by somebody who's never actually talked to somebody in their life, and it feels like it's written the same way you would write a book versus write a script. These conversations don't really flow naturally in terms of like actual actors. And you know, when you adapt a book necessarily to a script, you're not going word for word. You're definitely going to change things around so they kind of flow a little bit better. I also think that the George Lucas's method of directing wasn't really conducive for this way the script was written. I don't think that he kind of was able to guide them in a way that was able to overcome the kind of cumbersome nature of the dialogue and the script itself. So I think there's a lot going on there, but definitely the script is a main issue with this movie, and it especially, again, the dialogue, the actual dialogue itself, not necessarily the way it was shot, which is a criticism that is weird to me, but the way the dialogue is actually written and on the page, and the direction, and then again the acting, and it's, you know, I think it all kind of blends together and just creates kind of a mess. But that's one of the first things that I would say that the movie necessarily doesn't do too well. The next criticism I have about The Phantom Menace is that it ultimately, as terms of plot, feels pointless in the grand scheme of things. I really think that the whole entire movie could have been completely eliminated. I mean, you could not watch it, start with episode 2, and you're not going to lose anything. It doesn't really add anything of value to the story. I mean, you have really the main villain of this is either we want to look at it as the Trade Federation or Darth Maul. Lord Sidious / Palpatine is behind the scenes, and you kind of get this greater sense that there's something more going on, but he's not really a main character in this. The Palpatine himself kind of is a side character, but Lord Sidious really doesn't do much. You really kind of have the villain chasing him down of Darth Maul, and then really the Trade Federation and the Viceroy are the actual villains of this movie, but there's nothing there that it sets up. I mean, the blockade effectively doesn't do anything, or doesn't really have any effect on the greater scheme of things. They talk about it, and they mention it in episode 2, where they talk about how they still haven't lost their federation after basically breaking all the Senate's rules and things. There's nothing there. I mean, it introduces Anakin, but it doesn't really necessarily set anything up other than a few tidbits here and there that he's too old, and that his midichlorian count is extremely high, and stuff like that. But it doesn't necessarily set anything up that isn't reestablished or talked about again in the next movies, or that you kind of need to know about to kind of get a greater sense of things in the subsequent movies. So as a plot device, it really doesn't make sense to me. It kind of feels like it was just to kind of reestablish the universe and to kind of kick things off and get things going again, necessarily, versus tie into a greater scheme. It feels more like a prologue to me than it does necessarily a main established movie in this franchise and in this prequel trilogy. I generally just feel like you could honestly have skipped it, just in terms of the plot. I mean, there's a lot going on in the movie itself. I wouldn't want to eliminate the movie, because I feel like it does do a lot well. I just think that in terms of plot, it doesn't really kind of fit or do anything to the plot. Honestly, you could have started with episode 2, had episode 2 been the Clone Wars, and then had episode 3 be where it is, and the movie would have been fine. You literally could have started with the same movie of episode 2, Attack of the Clones. But that's kind of that's a thing with me. I just feel like overall that's why, to me, it comes off as a bit forgettable at its worst. I think episode 1 just kind of feels a bit... that's one of the things that kind of leads to it. I also feel that the movie played it too safe, but I don't necessarily think that's a criticism of the movie. I think it had to do that. I mean, you're talking about a brand that hadn't really been seen for almost 20 years at that point, and you're trying to reestablish this and reignite it for a new generation. Remember, this is not, they were trying to definitely capitalize on the nostalgia from people who grew up in the 80s and late 70s, were kind of introduced to Star Wars as a kid. They're trying to do that, but you're also talking about they're trying to recapture or to capture a new generation. So that is something that kind of had to been done, is to kind of play it a bit safe with things. There's been the criticism that it copies too much from A New Hope, for instance, or that it's too much of a just a copycat. I don't necessarily think that's true either. I think it played it safe, but again, I think it had to play it safe just because of what it was, where it was, and what it was trying to do. And I think that if they had taken too many risks, they really would have ended up kind of alienating fans. And I think that they did take some risks during the movie. I mean, that's definitely something that I feel like they did a little bit, but at the same time, overall, I think that they did play it safe. But I don't necessarily, again, see that as a bad thing for the movie. I just think that it's what kind of ultimately leads to this movie feeling a bit forgettable and just kind of a bit bland and things. There's no real style to it or anything. I think it kind of just, it fits in. It is what it is. It's there. But ultimately, yeah, that's one of the things that I take issue with this movie, that I think kind of isn't necessarily bad, but kind of holds it back from being greater than it could have been. All right, so you knew this criticism, this issue was coming up, but yeah, Jar Jar Binks. Let's talk about that, because to me, that's one of the biggest issues with this entire movie. And I feel like the movie knew that, not in this movie, but the subsequent movies kind of realized that. But I feel like Jar Jar Binks is a main problem with this movie. I don't feel he is as big of a problem as people make him out to be. I feel like he doesn't necessarily ruin the movie. I just feel like, again, it's another thing that kind of holds the movie back, and another thing that this is probably, Jar Jar Binks' character is probably the only thing I would say is probably bad about episode 1. Everything else I wouldn't say is necessarily bad or it ruins the movie, but this is the only thing I would say is actually bad. And a lot of it, it's unfortunate because it's not the actor's fault. I mean, Ahmed Best did his absolute best at trying to convey this character, and ultimately the script failed him, the animation failed him, but it's not his fault that that's what the character was. They were trying to force this kind of humorous character into it, and I think a lot of that had to do with the success of the Ewoks from Return of the Jedi, who were basically characters in there that they're one of the first characters that you were never named in the actual movie. You find out they're named from the toy line. That's one of the things there. So I think that the success from that kind of drove including a character like Jar Jar Binks that they thought kids would kind of latch on to. And you also kind of have this lack of comic relief throughout the movie. I mean, C-3PO and R2-D2 are introduced in the movie, but they're not the same characters yet that we kind of are familiar with, and they're not really in the movie necessarily prominently. but when they're there, they are the comic relief and they work, and we kind of remember the original trilogy and why it worked and why the humor worked there versus Jar Jar Binks, who kind of just ends up feeling obnoxious. Most of the humor is supposed to be kind of slapstick humor, but it really kind of feels just, you feel grimy kind of watching him and laughing. There's some kind of horrific moments, like where he gets his hand gets stuck in the blades, or his tongue goes numb because he gets it from the between the pod racer. But it's in some of them not actually funny, or when he tries to grab the whatever food, alien food on Tatooine, and it's just he kind of just feels like it feels wrong. It doesn't feel funny. It just kind of feels mean-spirited at times, I guess. And just as a character, I don't think it works. I don't have a problem with the Gungans necessarily, despite the fact that they never really have any effect on the overarching story or anything like that. Again, going back to the fact that the Phantom Menace, I feel like, is unfortunately really just kind of irrelevant, especially in terms of plot. The Gungans are another one, but I don't necessarily have a problem with the Gungans being introduced in general. I do specifically think Jar Jar Binks, though, is a character that could have been done without. And he is kind of it's just an obnoxious character. It doesn't work. It's not funny. The comic relief in the original trilogy, trying not to compare them, but it's kind of hard at this point. C-3PO and R2-D2 were the comic relief. There were definitely some comedic moments throughout. You have Han Solo talking to the Imperial and through the comm link, with the shoots and just boring conversation anyway. That's a funny scene. You laugh at that. There's some other, kind of humorous moments throughout there, but mostly you get the comic relief from C-3PO and R2-D2 and their kind of banter and their bickering back and forth. And a lot of it is more the way they do things necessarily than what they're actually saying or what they're actually doing. And they're never kind of just like, the humor it's situational humor. It's not necessarily that, C-3PO doesn't trip over everything constantly, and R2-D2 isn't like, spinning around and constantly shocking him or playing pranks or something, or just the humor doesn't come from one of them being like clumsy, versus Jar Jar Binks, where that's kind of basically all it's around, is he's a clumsy character, and we keep seeing him falling down and just getting into these awkward moments. And it falls flat and doesn't work. And I saw this movie when I was 9 and was a kid. I was the target demographic because I was a huge Star Wars fan at that point. I was excited to get new movies. I was excited to see, I was hoping that we would see a continuation, that we would get, our favorite characters back. But I was just excited to see Star Wars, and Jar Jar Binks really just fell flat. I mean, watching the entire movie, and I felt more irritated when he was on screen and just ready, kind of bracing myself for what he was going to do next, what awkward situation he was going to get himself into next, versus actually kind of finding it humorous or finding him, I guess, agreeable. So he just kind of really, really brings things down, and every scene that he's in, it's not great. I mean, there's moments though where, like, particularly on the sub, for instance, where I think his humor kind of works. There's moments where he's more serious in nature, and I think that kind of works. There's supposed to be this kind of character arc with him where he kind of saves the day at the end, but he's still doing like cringy things and just happens to, he accidentally throws the bomb. He accidentally opens the back of the carrier and all the bombs come out. He accidentally shoots the troops. And it's just like, it just doesn't really work for me. There is no development. Like, it would have actually been interesting to see him kind of come into his own throughout the movie than if they had started him off as kind of a bumbling idiot and just kind of turned him into something more, and by the end of the movie have him, leading the army for a reason. Kind of also feels out of place that he just suddenly becomes the the general. Suddenly they're giving him this. And at first, I actually thought that the Gungans were actually playing a prank on him, or not necessarily a prank, but were just kind of like doing it in a mean way to kind of kill him, essentially, or throw him into danger. But that's not the case, and I think that just the way it just feels kind of out of place the way it's done. And it feels like, why would they have done this for? Given him this responsibility, and then you watch him kind of fumble it again. So just overall, that's probably something. And I know that's a lot of people hate on Jar Jar Binks, and it's common to do that. And it's kind of, that's a free point essentially when you're talking about these movies. But I think it does need to be addressed, because I think that is a very valid criticism. But again, I don't think it goes as wouldn't go as far as some people say. I don't necessarily think having him ruins the movie. I just think that there's so many different ways that they could have done that character, and that they could have taken it, or even just not had that character, that would have made this movie that much better. So enough about what this movie does wrong and what it's not getting right. Let's talk about what this movie does well, and why I think that it rises above being mediocre or terrible, and actually ends up being a halfway decent movie. And to start things off, one of the things is I talked about the bad performances in this movie, which I think a lot had to do with the script and the direction, and nothing kind of being able to overcome that script. But one of the things is we do get some absolutely fantastic performances here, particularly from Ewan McGregor. I think he's really just kind of loving it, and you kind of get the sense that he really kind of embraced that character. And it's interesting to see Obi-Wan as a younger, I don't want to say kid, but definitely a younger Obi-Wan, because we're used to last time we saw him, well, it was as a ghost, but, this definitely older gentleman. And it's kind of interesting to see him full of energy and kind of more brash, and he kind of brought a fiery nature to the character that we kind of got a sense of in the original trilogy, but never really got in general. So I think his performance is actually very, very good in this movie. Ewan McDermott as Emperor Palpatine, well, at this point, Senator Palpatine, I think is absolutely fantastic. I think he's just got this creepy charm to him, and it really, really kind of works. I think he's really kind of good at hiding that, hiding the fact that he is pure evil. I think that is a really good job in this movie at doing that. So that's one of the things definitely I think this movie does right. Another thing this movie does well is the action and lightsaber combat in particular. They had always kind of hinted at, we got lightsaber fights in the original trilogy, but the way they kind of directed them, the way they designed them is George Lucas basically told them that, imagine you have a large broadsword. Imagine that, it's this heavy, lumbering kind of weapon, and it works, and they kind of retcon that in a way in the original A New Hope, because they said, okay, well, they're, one's very old and one's a machine, so they're not going to be at their peak performance at this point. But, it's kind of, even throughout that, especially when we get to Return of the Jedi, it's kind of hinted that there's more to lightsaber combat. There's more room to be acrobatic and things, and this kind of really opens that up. We get that fantastic final fight, but even before that, we get the Darth Maul versus Qui-Gon fight in the desert, and we kind of get a sense that there is more going on, and that there's, there's definitely, it's definitely nice to kind of see these fast-paced action scenes, with kicking and flying and flips and things. So I think the action, particularly with the lightsaber combat, something it does very well. Also, the actual space combat as well, I think, was kind of turned up a notch with this. And you can kind of see that it follows the same pattern as A New Hope or Return of the Jedi, where they're going into the big battle station and destroying it and whatever. But the actual scenes themselves are really kind of reminiscent, I would say, of the old fighter films that A New Hope's fighter scenes were based off of, and it really kind of has that vibe and that feel to it, and I kind of like that they brought that back. But it also just feels way more fast-paced. It feels just generally more action. It feels like everything was kind of turned up a notch, and I think that's something that was done very well, and back to the lightsaber fight specifically, I think that a lot of that had to do with the coordinator working on this movie, who worked on the prequels in general. I think just did absolutely knocked it out of the park, training the actors and the stuntmen, and just made sure everything was done right. And the cinematography during those fight scenes is gorgeous at times. I mean, probably some of the best that I've really ever seen through especially that ending fight. There's just some moments that are just absolutely beautiful throughout that. So I really think that one of the things at the very least that Phantom Menace nailed were the action scenes. The other thing I would talk about this movie, and I kind of mentioned it when I said that one of the complaints is that the movie kind of plays things too safe or copies A New Hope or Return of the Jedi or the original trilogy kind of too much and doesn't really kind of branch out or do its own thing, is that it really did what it needed to do. I don't think plot-wise, that was again one of my complaints, is that plot-wise it really kind of doesn't do what it needs to do. It doesn't really establish anything that is needed to know from this movie that carries on. But it did what it needed to do. It establishes this prequel universe, this idea of, and this is one thing I will talk about that I know people are going to be divisive about, but I kind of like the fact that they brought some of the political nature into it, because again, it's something that's really hinted out throughout the original trilogy, and particularly A New Hope, and they mention the Senate breaking down, and you get this idea that Princess Leia is this really kind of has this really formal attitude to her in the beginning of the movie, especially. You kind of get the sense that there was something else before it, and I like that they explored it. I think that they honestly could have done more with it. I think that it was the way they did it, I think, is the problem. I think that a lot of the way they did it ended up being boring or feeling out of place or feeling a little weird, because it kind of just throws you into it. But I do think that that's something cool to me that they kind of explored a little bit. And maybe it's just because I'm kind of a political nerd, but it's something I liked. I liked the fact that they kind of established this. It made the universe feel bigger, and it kind of helped, really kind of helped in the later movies when they bring some of it. It really kind of helps with the collapse, and you get this sense of this is a world of order and decorum, and you kind of get the sense of when you get to the original trilogy that it all just falls apart. It starts to fall apart even in the prequels, but episode 1 thing that does well is, I think, establishes that that kind of the dynamic of that entire universe, and I feel like it had to do that in order to get us to where it needs to go and where the prequel does actually end up going. So I think overall, despite the fact that plot-wise, I think that it doesn't really move anything, it doesn't really establish anything, it doesn't really do anything other than giving us the characters. It does what it needed to do in that sense. It does establish those characters. It does, I know I'm not kind of sounding contradictory here, but, it gives us Obi-Wan, it gives us Anakin, it gives us Padme, it kind of really, it brings us Palpatine for some moments, brings us to the Republic, and it sets things up, but at the same time, again, the further movies also do that same thing. But I think it works like that. It kind of really does help establish this universe and really kind of brings you into it, and kind of gets you amped up for what's coming next and to get ready for things. So I think that's something that it needed to do, and I think it does well. So that's why overall I think that despite kind of being a bit on the bland side and ultimately probably could be skipped in terms of plot, I think that as a movie it's a lot of fun to watch. We talked about the action scenes, talking about that's one thing as well, the pod racing scene, which I know a lot of people kind of feel slow down the movie, but especially knowing what I know about George Lucas and his fascination with hot rods and car racing, it's really a nice piece in that you get some just fantastic scenery, and it's fun to see. I mean, that's the thing. I think this, as a whole package, I think Phantom Menace does a lot. has these great action scenes. It does have this great universe building throughout it, and I think it overcomes those flaws. I think there is some legit criticism there. Again, I have my own criticisms of why the movie doesn't kind of quite grab me as much as it probably could have. There are a few things that bring it down, but overall, when you look at it as an entire package, that's why I think it's successful. That's why I think it works as a Star Wars movie, and why it works as a good movie, and why I would, choose to defend it. Why I would choose to say that it is actually a great movie, and why it actually works in the Star Wars universe, and again, why I'm here today just simply defending it. Thank you so much for watching episode 1 of the In Defense of the Star Wars Prequel series. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Make sure you're joining me on social media, on Twitter at Metalloud, on Instagram, Metal_Loud, on Facebook, facebook.com/Metalloud, as well as if you'd like to support me and donate, there's a Patreon, which is patreon.com/Metalloud, and make sure you join me next time for episode 2, Attack of the Clones.